Great. We'll start admitting people from the waiting room now. And when you join, if you could make sure you have your cameras muted or your microphones muted and your cameras off, that would be great. And we'll give it a moment for everybody to join the webinar and we'll get started.
You said cameras off or on?
You can leave your camera on for now if you'd
Yes.
like, but that's up to you. Great. So we can get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the U.S. Asia Institute's webinar, Beyond the Grid, Energy Statecraft Between Mongolia, Japan, and South Korea. My name is Karina Mori, and I'm a program assistant here at the U.S. Asia Institute. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. For a bit of background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 47-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. Today's discussion is part of our Northeast Asia in Focus webinar series, which offers insights into U.S. partnerships with Northeast Asian nations through speakers with firsthand knowledge of global power competition and regional issues. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly acknowledge our corporate stakeholders who help make this program possible: Organon, AIG, FedEx, Suntory, Coupang, PMI, Aiken, and Fairfield Maxwell. We do have time to open the floor for audience questions at the end, so please feel free at any time to ask questions using the chat function, and we'll address them during the Q&A portion. And this event will be recorded and posted to the USAI website for your review in the future. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Philip Andrew Speed is a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies China Energy Program. He has more than 40 years of experience in the field of energy and resources. The current focus of his research is on China's role in clean energy supply chains and the political economy of the low-carbon energy transition. His book, China as a Global Clean Energy Champion, Lifting the Veil, co-authored with Sufang Zhang, received the 2024 award for Best International Energy Economics Book from the International Association for Energy Economics. Dr. Andrew Speed has a PhD in geology from the University of Cambridge and LLM in resources law and policy from the University of Dundee. He is based in the United Kingdom. Ms. Telmen Altanshagai is an independent policy analyst based in Washington, D.C., specializing in energy security, climate policy, and development economics across the Global South, with a particular focus on Mongolia. Her current research examines how the global energy transition is shaping Mongolia's economic stability and long-term development strategy, alongside broader challenges in decarbonizing the global steel industry. Her policy and analysis and commentary has been featured in The Diplomat, East Asia Forum, The National Interest, and more. She holds a master's degree in international affairs from American University School of International Service and a BA from Bay Atlantic University. So to begin our discussion today, I'll turn it over to Ms. Altanshagai to share her opening remarks about Mongolia's third neighbor strategy and energy policy.
Great. Thank you very much, Karina. Greetings to everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. I'm Telmen. I'm very happy to be here and to start our webinar today. I wanted to go ahead and explore a couple of key concepts before we discussing the grid connection in Northeast Asia, and hope you like it. First slide, please. So when US Asia Institute reached out, they had an emphasis on Mongolia's third neighbor policy, and Dr. Andrew Speed recommended and suggested us to explain the policy first and then move on why it is important for the country and its strategic ambition in the region, and overall energy security calculus. So Mongolia's third neighbor policy first appeared in 2011 as a part of country's foreign policy concept. And it is really a core, one of the fundamental pillar when it comes to foreign policy strategy, which balances its two immediate neighbors, Russia and China, and beyond, because the multifaceted, multi-pillar foreign policy is a core for Mongolia. And third neighbor policy really is based on um, two criteria, if you wish, democratic values and economic advancement. And in 2011 document, uh, the government identified six countries, which includes the US, Japan, EU, South Korea, India, and Turkey. But in recent years, there has been a discussion about adding Kazakhstan, France, and Germany due to their increasing roles in Mongolia's engagement in world affairs. And as you all know, Mongolia sits in Inner Asia. I try to avoid calling Mongolia is part of East Asia or Central Asia. And yes, UN classify Mongolia as part of East Asia, but I find it disputable given Mongolia's Soviet and communist history. So I'd like to call it Mongolia sits in Inner Asian plateau and having two gigantic neighbors, Russia and China. Next slide, please. So my background is really in international relations, governance, and energy policy. And I wanted to briefly touch up on energy security policy in Mongolia and how I find it quite peculiar, and I call it peculiar paradox, a country which is energy abundant yet quite energy insecure. And explain why. So Mongolia's largest export product is energy, which is a form of coal to China. And until recently, coal has been a leading export product, mainly going to China, accounting a third of our export and almost more than 50% of export product to China. And in recent years, copper has been taking place, but I still think the role of coal is quite significant. And I don't want to get into too much detail, but this is another thermal coal that is used for heating or power. So the form of coal Mongolia exports to China is called coking coal or metallurgical coal, which is solely used for steel production. And as China urbanizes and um, its development is ongoing, China is expected to slow down its steel production, which is worrying for Mongolia because China has itself a coking coal reserve and production. So the question becomes if China decides to not to import coal from Mongolia, what happens? So revenue and future strategic planning and resource. So that should be a center to Mongolian policymakers. And on the other hand, Mongolia's largest import product is also happen to be energy, namely petroleum products for its transportation system, and it accounts one third of import, and which is mainly coming from Russia. And I'd like to thank energy security calculus in the country in a two dominant sector, if you wish, transportation as well as power. And when it comes to transportation, the country is virtually dependent on imported fuel, 97% coming from Russia and remaining coming from China and some from Kazakhstan. And if your economy is 100% dependent on Russian fuel, you ask yourself, how are we flexible when it comes to foreign policy and international engagement, given a war in Ukraine, for instance, and how do you balance your international profile as a democratic country and strive for peace when one of your neighbor is inactively engaging in combat. Um, there are some ongoing developments. For instance, Mongolia's first oil refinery project is underway and expected to complete it by 2028 with help of government of India and its soft loan. And interesting fact, it's actually India's largest infrastructure investment is in Mongolia and its oil refinery section, and which is quite surprising because India has been conventionally and traditionally receiving foreign assistance from developing world, but I'm glad to see that the time is changing because Mongolia and India has a special relationship. Um, Another point, import diversification. Because of war in Ukraine and their exchanges on infrastructure projects actively in Russia and Ukraine, Mongolia has been seeking to diversify its uh, energy import from Russia, including a conversation with China and Kazakhstan. And I believe there was a MOU signed in last April between government of Mongolia and as well as government of Kazakhstan. And furthermore, if you talk about energy security, there are three fundamental calculations to think of. It's security, sustainability, and affordability. And yes, you can diversify the import that you get from transportation, but at the end of the day, it is still dependency. So therefore, I believe transportation electrification should take a center stage in coming couple of decades when it comes to policy making, which kind of connects us to our main topic of today, expansion of renewable energy capacity and how the country could produce renewable energy and sustain its transportation sector through electrification. Briefly on power sector, Mongolia's power sector is heavily dependent on aging Soviet-era thermal coal plants, which is quite inefficient. I believe the latest estimate is inefficiency estimate is around 20 to 25%, which is quite high. And the power sector is heavily subsidized by the government, and it's quite a sensitive topic among policymakers. And unless if you want to pursue another term in office, you don't necessarily want to cut the state subsidies. So that can be a challenge. When it comes to electricity and power sector in Mongolia, the country imports 1/4 of it from mainly Russia and China. The western um, parts of the nation is not necessarily integrated into the central planning system. Therefore, the western provinces they import electricity and power from Russia and to the south from China, where a lot of mining activities are going on. So the domestic production of power ranges from around 75%. And from that 75%, really, those coal-fired power plants dominates its generation, accounting more than 90%. And underwhelmingly, only close to 10% comes from renewable energy. And um, I'd like to hear maybe Dr. Andrew Speed's reaction later when we talk about, potentially exporting renewable energy, but de facto, the reality is, the country is only able to sustain 10% of its electricity end use from renewable energy as of now. So that kind of creates this illusion where, like, yes, the country has a potential, but the infrastructure and I think the capacity is just not there yet. But it's equally important to discuss these topics. Next slide, please. And moving to our main topic, Asia Supergrid, or otherwise known as Northeast Asia Power System Integration. So it is really a aspirational concept that dates back to early 2010s, and again, it's a visionary concept. I don't believe there has been a cross country grid connection at least between, for instance, China and South Korea or China and Japan yet. And it was a vision for countries to propose and connect energy abundant countries like China and Mongolia, to an extent Russia, to energy scarce countries such as Japan and South Korea through one interconnected network, which could utilize a vast energy in Mongolia's Gobi Desert using wind energy as well as solar, and potentially expanding that energy to through northern China, hopefully maybe in South Korea and Japan. And the technical assistance studies and feasibility studies has been happening since 2010s. But again, it's still in the feasibility stage where geopolitics can take a center stage because connecting your grid system creates a form of dependency. And if you're following the politics in war in Ukraine and how a certain country's weaponized energy system, it should create you a red flag. So how do you navigate that? Just to close the loop, why Mongolia's potential solar and wind power is important. According to 2020 ADB a paper, it was estimated that Mongolia has enormous potential, and the word potential is important because potential doesn't necessarily equalizes the capacity or availability to export it right away. And I would love to hear about Dr. Andrew Speed's opinion on these kind of issues. But for now, my opinion is the politics between, for instance, China and Japan and China and South Korea, it's still lukewarm. And again, I'm not quite positive about, for instance, Japan wanting to integrate, its energy infrastructure system through Russia, for instance, and God bless, maybe Ukraine might decide one day to bomb that infrastructure, which creates paralysis in the whole system. So um, that's a risk that you should account in any coming decades. But nevertheless, this is an important conversation to have. I'll end with that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for those insights and helpful context into Mongolia's energy situation. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Andrew Speed to offer his opening remarks about energy strategy and connectivity in the region as well.
Thank you, Karina, and thank you, Telmen, for a very helpful introduction, not only for me, but for other participants here. And just for the participants, I come here not as a specialist in Mongolia's energy sector or in the Asian energy grid. I come as someone who's worked on regional energy cooperation, notably in Southeast Asia, and also as we come on to the whole critical minerals issue. I'm working on that as well as my expertise in China. So first, my introductory remarks have two parts. One is energy cooperation, which Telmen has already kicked off, but the other is the critical minerals that she didn't mention, but that I will then pick up on. Regional energy cooperation is difficult. Wherever you are in the world, in whatever form, whether it's electricity and natural gas pipelines, whether it's oil security cooperation, sharing emergency supplies, or whatever. Why? Because energy is seen as a national security issue, and this is particularly at the moment with Hormuz closed and the Red Sea likely to be closed by the Houthis. And so there's this preference for maximizing self-reliance. And of course, many countries can't do that, but at least you try and maximize your self-reliance. If you have resources, then they are a national asset. And so you guard their use and their sale jealously. In addition to the governments thinking about these things, the national energy companies are also very jealous of their source of economic and political power that comes from them controlling the resource, the extraction of the resource, and the grid system, whether it be electricity or gas. So this is always difficult wherever you are. And we can come to the European Union later if you want to talk about that. When it comes to regional electricity grids, it's even more difficult. I mean, not least because of the technical requirements of electricity grids that they balance all the time. Okay, but setting aside that, to get anything done, you need strong national government support from all the relevant countries. Not least, to go back to what I've just said, to stop the energy companies undermining the plans. You need the grid infrastructure between the countries and, in the case of Mongolia, within the country. And to do that, you need finance. To get the finance, you either, if you're not taking loans or aid, you need the incentives to build the grids. And you need the incentives for the buyers of power to buy the power. And then you've got the whole issue of technical harmonization, which compared to the political and economic and financial problems is relatively straightforward. So for Mongolia, as Telmen has said, there's huge potential for renewable energy. But you need two things. You need the investment in renewable energy within Mongolia. Well, it's three things. You need the investment in renewable energy in Mongolia. You need the grid to be invested in within Mongolia to take it to the border, and then you need the cross-border infrastructure. Yes, in principle, there is demand from Japan and Korea for clean energy, reliably delivered, but as Telmen's map shows, it has to run across China and then either under the Yellow Sea to South Korea or through North Korea, the former being more preferable, I would suggest. So this has always been a challenging undertaking, and I think the challenge for Mongolia is it doesn't end up with a stranded asset, all this wonderful renewable energy potential that never gets realized because of the very political and economic and financial challenges that Telmen and I have outlined. So I think this is, it would be disappointing to say it's a pipe dream, but it's difficult to see it's happening in the near future. If others in the participants have different views, I'm sure Telmen and I would be delighted to hear them. So that's my bit on the renewable, on the grid, etc. Now, what Telmen didn't share, but is a topic for today's conversation, is that Mongolia supposedly is rich in resources of many minerals. Okay. And this, in principle, should be easier than an electricity grid because you don't need an electricity grid. You've got international markets. You can sell it to anybody you like, provided you can get it on a railway line somewhere or onto a ship. Now, what puzzled me, I read one or two Mongolian documents that gave large numbers for reserves, not just of fluorspar, rare earths, molybdenum, tungsten, etc. But when I went to the annual report of the US Geological Survey, Mongolia didn't really feature except for fluorspar. So that, as an ex-mineral geologist of many years ago, I'm thinking, how well proven are these reserves? Are they resources? Yes, they're in the rock somewhere. People know they're there, but how much is it going to take to prove the commerciality and to make it marketable? And I just, to use an analog, we go back 3 or 4 years, and the US was saying, well, if we help Ukraine, we want to get hold of the rare earths. But yeah, maybe there are rare earths in Ukraine, but it's going to take years, if not decades, to bring them, to exploit them and whatever. So I have a big question mark there as to the commerciality and the scale of the resource. it's a question mark. I'm not saying they're not there, but I think I would need to see more reliable numbers. I mean, we know of the big Rio Tinto uh, Mongolian mine, copper mine, that is big, that is working, that is great. The ores, the concentrates are shipped to China, where they are there processed into refined into copper. But I think the experience of Rio Tinto and others mining in Mongolia reveal the investment risks for mining industry. And these include the political and regulatory risks. The regulations keep changing. There are lots of threats from the government about Rio Tinto's behavior, and I'm not in a position to explain whether that Rio Tinto's behavior was unreasonable or not. But they've had a tough time. There are potential or actual shortages of electricity, as Telmen has mentioned, but also of water. The mining and processing of minerals needs lots of water. There's high transportation costs to move stuff, even just to the border. And of course, at the moment, Mongolia is dependent on China as an export route. So again, if you think about ores being mined and the and then being concentrated in Mongolia, they're then sent to China for processing. Yes, Mongolia may want them to end up in Japan and Korea, but will they end up in Japan and Korea? Once they go to China, Mongolia may lose control of that supply chain. So agreements between Japan and Korea on one hand and Mongolia will be very difficult to enforce. Not impossible, but difficult. And then there's a question that all mining countries have, is that to gain the value added, you need to have the processing plants and the refineries to produce the final metals, if not the final magnets or whatever. But of course, in Mongolia, as everywhere, this will depend on the scale of resource and the scale of production. You can't build a processing plant for small production, but also the availability of electricity and water. So, whilst the mineral story may appear to be easier than electricity, and I think it can be, if you're prepared to send it to China, if you particularly want it to go to Japan or Korea as your partners in this supply chain, I think that's going to be a bit more difficult. So I've looked at energy cooperation, regional scale, and my experience in Southeast Asia tells me that is extremely difficult. They've been working it for 30 years on the Asia power grid, ASEAN power grid. Minerals easier, but still with challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Andrew Speed, for that very helpful context. I do have a question, and both of you alluded to this in your remarks. And my question is, given Mongolia's geographic realities, how can it effectively pursue energy statecraft with Japan and South Korea when any major infrastructure or trade routes would have to pass through Russia or China? You both seem to acknowledge that there are several challenges to doing so, whether it would be energy or critical minerals, but thinking about how that might be possible, if you could kind of explore that a little bit.
I will leave that to Telmen since she's the regional diplomatic specialist.
Thank you. It seemed to be a very easy question to answer, right? But at the same time, to me, again, the limitation lays on the connectivity part, as Dr. Andrew Sweet mentioned. It has to go through either Russia and China, and current de facto politics and geopolitics do not seem to be favor any routes, either through Russia and China. So for the foreseeable future, it will be challenging. But nevertheless, for instance, a couple of days ago, President of South Korea was in Mongolia during a high-level state visit, and two countries signed, I believe, 21 memorandum of understanding, which heavily focused on actual energy cooperation and critical minerals. And South Korea expressed provide technical assistance, exploration, and training when it comes to skilled workers, which signals the shift in the fact that yes, it might be difficult at the moment, but there's a clear direction of we're willing to invest in your energy statecraft and maybe in potential in the future Northeast Asian power grid. Similar signals coming from Japan. Um, I'm not sure if it's a right way to say this, but King of Japan was in Mongolia last year doing similar high level visit, and again, there has been willingness to invest also in energy infrastructure in Mongolia. So these are like small noises, I would say, but nevertheless, kind of signals where the priorities in the country is heading. And I would like to add also India. Mongolia's president visited in New Delhi last fall, and they signed a couple of MOUs, which also heavily concentrated on energy cooperation as well as critical minerals. And I believe there has been ongoing talks about India potentially importing Mongolia's coking coal slash metallurgical coal for their steel industry. But again, India has to, find a way to get that commodity, whether is it going to be through China, is it going to be Russia, which one is economically viable? So I would say the connectivity part definitely limits the Mongolia's flexing room if you wish to make these kind of policies, but at the same time, there has been a strong language and focus on energy, statecraft, and infrastructure investment in as a policy priority amongst the policymakers, which is a positive note, I would say.
I'll try and add a bit of different, or I mean, try and pursue this a bit further. I think the coking coal is really interesting because if China doesn't need coking coal or less in the future, then it would allow coking coal to flow into China and then to India. Okay, because there's nothing to be jealous about. When it comes to the critical minerals, I think, sorry, Karina, there's somebody in the waiting room. I think you could argue that the more that is produced, the better. Okay, so if Mongolia suddenly starts producing more and more and more, well, then that's that. Whatever happens to it, that has to be a good thing. But on the other hand, if you say, well, would China be more amenable to cooperating in electricity or cooperating in critical minerals, then one might say, well, critical minerals is China's lever on the world. So it's likely to be less cooperative in general, though there may be specific minerals that they're happy to work with you. Whereas an electricity grid, in principle benefits everybody, because it can flow to any direction who is ever short of it. I mean, it doesn't solve any of your problems. I was just trying to add a bit of nuance and maybe a bit of optimism there.
Great. It's very helpful in understanding the relationship and kind of what's at stake in the region. Another question that I'm curious about is what extent will Ulaanbaatar need to rely on energy partnerships with China for financing, given its domestic grid challenges and capital shortages, even if it does complicate its third neighbor strategy with Japan or South Korea?
Dr. Andrew Speed, would you like to take that?
Well, I'm assuming that Mongolia doesn't have much money. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
That would
Yeah,
be correct.
right. So who's the person in this region who, at least in principle, has a lot of money that it's prepared to throw around? And I presume, is Mongolia part of the Belt and Road Initiative?
It is, yes.
It is. Okay. Well, then presumably China would be willing to invest, stroke, make loans, buy into. I mean, the state grid has bought up shares in or the totality of grids in different countries. So it's doing a lot of grid investment, or making loans. So yeah, I think this is eminently possible. What would Mongolia would have to make sure is that it didn't become heavily indebted to China, as for example another neighbor of Laos of China has done, which is Laos. So I think cautiously managed, China could become a major supporter either through loans or through ownership of Mongolia's grid, and they would have to be the driver of that regional connection. However, and I bring my story from Southeast Asia, and I'm a little out of date, but there's a Mekong Delta region cooperation system that includes electricity, okay? And there are wires all over the place, and there's a coordination committee that met for several years in the 2010s to decide where the control system for the regional grid would be. Initially, there were three proposals: Thailand, Laos, and China. Laos stepped back. Laos has all the hydro, uh, presumably under pressure from China. And among the member countries, nobody could agree, should it be Thailand or China? And eventually, the minutes were public. Maybe they still are. I used to read the minutes of this annual meeting. Eventually, the chairman of this committee said, I give up. I can't do this anymore. I'm handing it to my superiors. And to my knowledge, no agreement has been reached. So the whole thing of China's involvement becomes very political in a regional setting, because China wants to dominate the grid and its controls, and there may be actors who do not want it to dominate. So that's just a warning from Southeast Asia.
I'd like to add a couple of points on Karina's question. I think again, depending on where you're coming from, there's a popular notion of Chinese coercion and its use of its supply chain, for instance, in many Asian countries. But at the same time, in my humble opinion, Chinese are very business-minded people, you know. They care about profit, they care about viability, and given Chinese investment in foreign infrastructure, they seem to be the only one actually in the world that are willing to invest in those countries and their infrastructure system. And on the contrary to popular belief, the Western nations, they don't necessarily invest in infrastructure. They invest in governance, they invest in democracy building, for instance, which is kind of in limbo as we speak of right now. So if you are a country and that is developing and you need cash to build an infrastructure project to get your economy going, and if China is offering money, you say yes. So I think it's important to think alike from those countries' perspective. And I wouldn't say not all projects are a hidden meaning or viability. It's depending on also the host nation's ability to navigate and negotiate those contracts and viability of contract and Dr. Andrew Speed mentioned about stranded asset. You know, you have to do your technical assistance report, feasibility report, etc. Maybe perhaps with an assistance from ATB, IFC. So there are ways to navigate those mega projects, and I will leave it at that. But another one last point I wanted to mention is Mongolia recently completed its first renewable energy auction, and they are planning to build a couple of solar power plants, wind turbines in the central region, but surrounding provinces. And it was special in a sense that it was an auction, and companies, either domestic or foreign companies, um, submitted their proposal and submitted their tariffs and price, and I believe five of them won, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, three of them were Chinese companies. So in a sense, there's a fair competition, and again, Chinese knows to do their business, and they seem to be doing well adjusted in market economy where they're the one who's promising lower value and good work. And if that's the case, and if each party agrees, and I think that is a fair deal.
And while we've been talking about China's role and China's strategy in this, another question that I have is, how do you see Beijing responding to closer trilateral energy alliances between Mongolia, Japan, and South Korea? Um, if Mongolia continues to scale up cooperation with Japan and South Korea, what impact might China see this having on its own energy strategy in the region and its own influence in the region?
I'll give a couple of points if Dr. Andrew Speed is okay with that. I think, like, if I'm, honestly speaking, I don't think China cares that much because it's a gigantic country and it has enormous demand. Like, it has its own problems, and I don't think there is a strategic risk for China for Mongolia and Japan, for instance, cooperating on energy issues, and China understands Mongolia's strategic position and its balancing strategy, including third neighbor policy, and as well as Russia too. So I don't think there's a big risk, in my opinion, on that. But again, Dr. Andrew Spade mentioned it would be preferable for Japanese and South Korean companies to invest in critical minerals, which seem to be politically more viable in a near future. So I would say that. And one more thing, and like my thoughts are kind of like jumping to my mind. I hope that's okay. And I was talking to a Japanese businessman who worked in a power transmission at Johns Hopkins event a year ago or so, and he really wanted to, and he's speaking of his own experience, and he really wanted to invest in Mongolia's power grid and energy systems. And something that he said was really true in a sense, was also funny. He said, "You have only 3 million people. It's not a big market to invest in. So perhaps the market size also influences." But again, if the government is willing to invest in that infrastructure and willing to connect those infrastructure at least to northern China or to the north to Russia, that's a starting point. And it's a long shot. Dr. Andrew Speed, would you like to add?
Great. I've noticed a number of great questions coming in through the chat, so I'm going to turn to a few of these now as well. And one question is having to do a little bit more with implementation. And so, a question from Henry is, I was wondering what conditions would be necessary for a regional power grid to deliver the objectives of each participating country, particularly given their different energy security priorities.
I will talk around that question. I mean, what's the advantage of a regional grid? It is to move energy to where it is produced, to where it is needed. Now, in many places, and I'm not speaking about Northeast Asia, this may be a seasonal issue. Yeah. So you may be sending electricity one way at certain times of year, the other way at other times of year, or a country has a power crisis for whatever reason, and you can send the power in when normally it's sending it out. So you need everybody to be able to gain either financially, economically, because they're selling power, or they're a transit country, they're raising a transit tariff, or they're a receiving country. So everybody has to get something out of it. But I think, one of the transit, if you're just a transit country, you can't use this just as a way to raise huge amount of money because then the project doesn't happen. So everybody has to balance their interests. So I think those are the conditions. Everybody has to get something as a buyer, as a seller, i.e. either long-term buyer, long-term seller, or seasonal buyer, seasonal seller, or crisis buyer, crisis seller. So in very simple terms, everybody has some potential, has to have some potential to gain, either in energy or in money. And sorry, and the clean energy in the case of some countries. Here's clean energy coming to help me deal with my commitments to go green.
Miss Altanshagai, do you have anything you wanted to add to that question before I move on to another?
Sure. I'll throw a couple of points. I would say in the past few years, I think each individual country's strategy has shifted, and in the past couple of months, the closure of Strait of Hormuz and its impact on countries in Asia, for instance, and their dependency and their insecurity when it comes to energy. Um, I'm not an expert on grid connection, and so probably Dr. Andrew Speed knows that better. But if yes, it's difficult to build these mega infrastructure projects, but maybe starting point is really, as Dr. Andrew Speed said, in case of kind of like emergency minor connection, but like as time goes by, if it's viable, I think that the countries could decide to expand that network, but it could start as some kind of like energy transmission lines in case of emergency. I could see that happening in the coming couple of decades, but not necessarily. Oh, let's build super Asian grid system that kind of connects Russia, China, and South Korea. Like, I don't think that's happening anytime soon, or at least in my lifetime.
Just to give an example, the connection between Malaysia and Singapore is very small in scale, but that is exactly it. It's for emergencies. They're now scaling it up for larger scale trading. Yeah.
Very interesting point about using it for emergency connectivity. Another question that we have is, do you think sales on a regional grid should be based on long-term power purchase agreements like in Southeast Asia or in market-based trading as in Nord Pool and the South of Africa Power Pool?
Right. This is a question that I planted. Okay. So, a power purchase agreement is an agreement between a producer of energy and a buyer. Two companies, they may be state-owned, they may be private. And we've seen this Laos selling to Thailand. And that has a certain quantity of power every year for a certain price. In principle, the agreement can be reached quite quickly between the two parties, corporate parties, but obviously with government support. So that's an advantage. The disadvantage is that it constrains later development of a power market. And I'll come on to the power market. And also the sale is one way, generally. Doesn't allow for sending the other way. A regional market with the relevant infrastructure is more economically efficient for the region. Okay, that is the way that you save everybody building more power capacity because if you need a bit more, you buy it. It allows power to flow in any direction from any of the multiple parties. In the case of ASEAN, that would be 10, actually now 11 parties at any time. You'd have day ahead or even shorter time trading. Now, one of the arguments is, you need an EU type organization to oversee it. And the answer is you don't. So if you look at the Nordic system, the power market in the Nordics, there is no overriding authority. Okay, there is the Nordic Council, which is an interparliamentary body, and the Nordic Council of Ministers, where relevant ministers meet. So in the early years of the Nordic power market, the different utilities agreed to develop it. And once you'd agreed the market, it set the incentives to build the wires, and so they didn't have to build much generating capacity. Okay. So, the Nord Pool is a strange example, but of course, they had many shared cultural features. They were sharing a lot anyway, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland. And so they were old friends in a general way that were doing stuff together at the very lowest level, social things as whatever. So they were used to doing it. You go to the EU, supernatural body, hugely difficult. I mean, 35 years ago, when I was doing my LLM in Dundee, I wrote about the efforts to build some kind of market. There were electricity directives, there were gas directives. Everybody except the Brits were ignoring it. Um, it's taken decades to get anything done, and it's working. Okay, that's fine, but it took a long time. So I think the issue is not do you have a supernatural body or not? It's whether you've got real willingness to create a market. However, in the short term, if you, Mongolia, just wish to sell clean energy to somebody, then you take the Laos route and have a bilateral power purchase agreement. But I say the trouble is those agreements, the more you have, the more difficult it is then to bring in a market later. So I haven't answered what you should do, but I've talked around. I hope the difference is satisfactory.
Definitely very helpful in understanding the willingness that's involved. And if Mongolia were to look into its regional grid and implementation and market, what it might look like. And you gave a great example of the bilateral agreements. And so when I think we should have time for another question or two. So I'm seeing a question, how do you see the relevance of Russian imports to the reluctance of the power sector to remove the import dependence?
I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the import is mainly concentrated on the western part of the country, which is isolated from the central grid system. And yes, it creates a risk, if Russia changes its minds tomorrow and decides to cut power, or a couple of days ago, because of the Ukrainian attacks in Russian energy infrastructure, there were a couple of hours of disruption in power electricity in the western provinces. I mean, people are not necessarily happy about it, and at the same time, the price of that imported energy is higher than the domestically produced one, also. And again, everybody knows it. Everybody knows the problem, right? And and they're trying to work towards it by building those solar panels or wind turbines. But I think the problem is again, it's economical, and politics can play into it, right? Um, So I don't have an answer to that. I guess that the policymakers back home, they're working on it, and they know that the western part of Mongolia is heavily dependent on imported power. But some might argue that it kind of creates a sense of security in case of, power disruption in Ulaanbaatar, and if the grid is connected, we can import a power during nighttime, for instance, from Far East Russia. So depending on how you see it, it's up to the interpretation. But I think the policymakers, as we speak, they recognize the risk, and they're trying to work on it.
A question for you, Telmen. Why don't they then build these renewable power plants in the West and then you can remove reliance on Russia?
Yes, they are. They're on it. In fact, they announced a couple of a proposal for companies to bid on recently, a couple of weeks ago. So these are very recent developments. And I mentioned this earlier. Uh, the Mongolia's first renewable energy auction happened like a month ago, and three Chinese companies won, and a couple of domestic ones won. So I think the priority goes usually to the central region and its connectivity, and to the west there, a couple of people, and they don't seem to care that much. But I'm sure that's on their agenda, and and yeah, I think they're on it, sir. Karina?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Andrew Speed, for that question as well. I think the last question that we'll have time for today, if you could touch briefly on some of the investments that have made by Japan or South Korea in Mongolia, either in electric power or critical minerals development.
I'm not too well versed when it comes to critical minerals investment from Japan or South Korea, but I know there has been a long-standing presence by Chinese as well as Japanese companies when it comes to Mongolian mining climate. So I can see there must be some Japanese companies when it comes to critical mineral investment. Um, but like since critical minerals like such a hot topic in the past few years, again, the president of South Korea was here a couple of days ago and signed a bunch of memorandums on critical minerals, and I can see it will be heavily concentrated on the exploration part, and as Dr. Andrew Speed mentioned, the commerciality and viability of those resources. Um, but I'm sorry, I don't have a straight answer to that.
That's super helpful. And if Dr. Andrew Speed, if you don't have anything to add, I think we'll end here. Thank you both so much for your thorough and thoughtful answers. I'm so glad we were able to cover such a diverse range of topics and questions from the audience. And I'd like to thank our audience as well for your participation and your questions. So while we're out of time for the briefing portion of today's event, if you would like to follow up with any of today's speakers, please reach out to us, and we'd be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the issues and connecting you with them. And as a reminder, this webinar is recorded and will be posted on our website, usasiainstitute.org, where you can also learn more about future USAI events and webinars. Thank you all again for joining us, and thank you to Dr. Andrew Speed and Ms. Altanshagai, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Thank you both.
Thank you, Karina. Thank you, Dr.
Absolutely.
Andrew Speed.